Welcome to Caliban Command. Today I'm going to cover how I paint Desolation Marines. The colors I use throughout this video are currently on screen, and I'm happy to share this with you all. First off, I'm going to start by breaking the model into sub-assemblies, which is done prior to this, and priming everything with Army Painter Black. From there, I proceed to dry brush Abaddon Black over it to get a nice consistent base coat. This takes me a little while, so I'm going to cover a couple things that I do in preparation to paint. First off, I thin all of my paints when I get them. I add a couple drops of thinning agent to each bottle as I buy them. This allows me to just drop what I'm doing and paint anytime that I have free time. And it's a common practice for me to paint while at work, on my lunch, or things of that nature while I'm recording. I do this just so that I can get a little bit of time in between workloads and just have a good time, honestly. It's a nice mental break from my workday and brings me back to work refreshed and ready to get back at it. After I broke everything down and primed it, I used some sprue to give me little handholds. You see it a little bit on the tabletop in this image. I'm wanting to cover a couple things like this because they're really good ways to get handles on sub-assemblies that aren't expensive because you're already getting them with the model itself. I just use a little bit of hobby glue to attach it, and then I operate it as though it were a painting handle from there. It popped off really easily at the end of this, and I definitely will be doing this in the future. It's something new I tried specifically for this video. From there, I move on to my Mephiston Red, and I put this across the Aquila, the belts, pouches, and then also later on the helmet lenses, but that is done in a later step so as to not cloud it with Nuln Oil when we get there. This takes me a little bit of time, and I use a set of detail brushes across the model range. I don't really use a specific brand of brush. I kind of pick up whatever's cheap because I'm not really good at taking care of brushes yet. It's a skill I'm working to improve on, and I think the wet palette I recently acquired will definitely help me get into some better brush habits. This takes me a little bit, and I honestly, detail work is just something that takes me a while, and I enjoy doing it. I'm not phenomenal at it, but I'm working on getting better with each model that I do. I bring the model in and out of focus a lot, and I'm sorry for that. I'm working on upgrading my recording space and fleshing that out a little more. Now, I want to pay special attention to how I'm doing this belt. If I were to go back, I would probably work downward rather than side to side here, just for consistency's purposes and making it look a little neater, and I think it would give me a little better control. Now I'm working on the pouch at this exact second in the video, and honestly, that's another space I should have worked down rather than side to side. It's a bad habit that I have where I don't keep my brush strokes consistently moving the same direction. It's fine when I'm dry brushing, but whenever I'm working on detail work, it's not really conducive to a nice even finish in my opinion. I sometimes end up with streaks that I'm still working on getting ironed out fully. You can see there I hit the leg plate just a bit. I'll go back through and touch that up, and honestly that's part of why I do things in the order that I do. I don't see the reason to shade Nuln Oil across the armor plates while I'm still picking out details, because I'm going to eventually go back through and touch up my black. I'm going to put the Nuln Oil over the red anyway, so why not hit all of it at one time? From here, I move on to the rocket launcher arm and getting the lovely red trim that I do for anything in the Dreadwing done on it. The Dreadwing, I do red trim along the shoulder pads and the belts, and the reason I do that is to make them stand out. The Dreadwing aren't a thing in 40K, but I like to design my different units as though they were from different wings in the Horus Heresy because I like the aesthetic changes that you can make with it. I think it's a fun way to show it on the tabletop. I think it's a fun way to note it. It can also be useful if you're doing something aside from what you see as what you get gaming, because it's easier to mark out the individual units. For instance, in the case of these Desolation Marines. If I do a unit where I'm wanting them to have different equipment than what I assemble them with, I can always go through and denote different squads with different markings. For instance, put a silver trim along the shoulder pad rather than the red, or things of that nature. It's a really quick way to distinguish squads, and honestly, it can be helpful for your opponents. Now, as far as here we are on the wings, on the shoulder pad, this is a fun one, and I think I'm really happy with how the wings came out on this model in particular. You'll see why in a later section of the video once some more color is on it and once we get the shader down. Here I've moved on to Ironbreaker, and I'm picking out my silver across the shoulder pad. From there, I believe I move on to the ammo crate after I get some more paint. And honestly, the way that I do the shoulder pads, I would probably do a little differently if I had the option to go back, but I am a stickler for consistency and some of the small detailing. Color on the shoulder pad is one thing. Color on, for instance, a name marking plate or stuff of that nature bothers me a little more if it's inconsistent, and I'm trying to keep a nice consistent look across all of my individual units. Now, that's not to say again that some trim markings might not change squad to squad, but I almost consider those squad markings rather than full-blown aesthetic changes. I go through and hit the belt buckle and the gun handle, and then proceed to go to the ammo crate. I use a broader brush here to save myself some time, and I believe I end up giving it 2 coats, which is a strange choice for me as I typically do single coat metallics. From there, I should be moving to the gun. Now, something I'll mention here, I did not sub-assemble the backpack when I got started, and going back, that's something I'd already have sub-assembled in the future. I do that during one of the cuts, and I get it sub-assembled and ready, and then catch it up through the color scheme that I used across the rest of the model. Now, something I wanted to mention about squad markings. Occasionally, I will use Caliban green across the circle on the backpack. The reason I do that is to denote any of the Caliban-born members of my redeemed Dark Angels. That is an old squad marking, well, not squad marking, but marking used during the Horus Heresy, and it's something that I've carried forward into my 40k Dark Angels. Now, keep in mind when I note that I use Horus Heresy markings and things of that nature, that's because the way that my Dark Angels are built has the redeemed folded back into them and brought up to modern speed. Here I'm going through the Ironbreaker base coat on the rocket launcher. Following this, I should be moving to Necromancer Cloak Gray, if I recall correctly. Now, this is all to say, as far as the markings go, you can do them however you want. I personally love the Horus Heresy to an extent that I have brought it forward into my 40k army. I think it's a lot of fun. It gives me some weird options later on down the road too. I, for instance, have some Deathwing plans to make a Cataphracti squad into Deathwing Knights. That'll be a fun little side project, and it'll be a fun kit bash for me. I also intend on making some Deathwing Command Squad units out of Cataphracti armor, and I'll play them as though they have the Indominus armor, because there's no rules for Cataphracti armor. But the aesthetic design is nice, and I personally enjoy it. Now, after this, I go through and touch up some stuff that I messed up, I believe. I messed up some of my black base coat on the rocket launcher in particular. And going back, I'd probably use a smaller detail brush and pick out some of my markings a little bit easier there. Instead of going through and touching up my blacks, I would instead use a detail brush and block them out so that I had a little bit of silver built around them before I started on the dry brush that I'm doing now. all in all, I've been really pleased with how this Marine came out. There's the backpack I mentioned. I got it base coated with black, just like I did the rest of the model. The Abaddon black looks really striking once Nuln Oil is put over it, and I think it makes a really nice deep black over that matte black primer. From there, I go through and catch the backpack up with the rest of the colors, starting, I believe, at red and then silver. But the Necromancer cloak goes onto the gun and helps darken it up and create some contrast against the gray, or against the black of the arm. The Necromancer cloak is a favorite of mine, just because of the fact that it has a really good coverage rate, in my opinion. It's not the best gray I've ever worked with, but it is far from the worst, and I think it is honestly top 3. Right behind Mechanicus Standard Gray, which I think is a little too bright for this project, and Corax Black, which I use on a lot of bolter casings. The Necromancer Cloak is a good stand-in for Corax, or where you want to create a small finishing difference between the two, and I really like how it comes out on this particular project. From there, I would honestly recommend getting some really fun detail brush sizes. I don't use a lot of them. I use this brush a lot. I can't remember the brand of it to save my life, but I honestly picked it up at Hobby Lobby, I think for like $3 or $5. It's a great brush. It's super easy to clean. I have no issues with it at all, and it's, again, just cheap. It's nice. I don't have bristle separation, and I don't have any issues with the bristles holding paint more severely like I have with some of GW's more recent synthetic brushes. I'm not a big fan of the synthetic brushes that they've released. I do not get good mileage out of them, in my opinion. Now, again, I'm not good at brush care, and if you guys have any recommendations for brush care solutions, please put them in the comments. I'm always happy to look through things and try things out. In fact, it's one of my favorite things about the hobby is getting to try out new products and seeing how they work. I used Balthazar Gold to pick out the rocket itself. I think it's a very striking contrast. And then I also use it on the smaller missiles down below on the, I think this is the Vengor launcher. Now, the Marine itself is a fairly easy paint job. It's just like my Intercessors and my Infernus Marines. The main reason I wanted to go through this is to show how I pick out the different detailing on the missile launcher itself, as well as some of the accoutrements for the armor. Now, the tactical